Now, good morning. If you didn't hear me the first time, hopefully you heard me this time. Lesson 6 of our study of David and Solomon, although Solomon hasn't come into play yet, other than a brief mention of his birth. We've been looking into the situation, the unfortunate situation between David and one of his other sons, Absalom, who first killed his brother, or had his brother killed, then ran away, then came back, and then schemed and sort of slithered his way into leading a rebellion against David to take the throne from his father, and ultimately being killed in that affair. And David, last week we saw his extreme mourning over the death of his son. So that battle ended. The whole rebellion ended when Absalom was killed. David was victorious, but he didn't feel very victorious. He didn't celebrate. As far as he was concerned, there was no cause for celebration. This was more of a time of mourning than of celebration. Sort of the exact opposite. Normally, this kind of event would spark great celebration between everybody, really. But not this time. The impact that David's demeanor had on the people was pretty clear. Chapter 19, verse 3 says verse 3 says, the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. Although they were successful and victorious, but that's not what it looked like to the eye anyway, because the king was acting in a way that sort of set the tone for everybody else. If the king is acting in this way, maybe it's not the best idea for us to be celebrating, obviously. So that's what they did. Somber, solemn. And in verse 4, we read that instead of rejoicing with his army for the victory, it says, the king covered his face and he cried with a loud voice, the same words that he had been crying before when he first heard the news. Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. So David's mind was, that's all he could think about, was the death of his son. And we talked about that pretty extensively last week. We can understand to an extent why David was more focused on that than the victory, but at the same time, that could have potential ramifications and repercussions, and that is actually what Joab comes back into the picture to tell David. As we've already seen, Joab was not the best guy in the world. He was pretty snakish himself, but we can't help but admire him for his honesty and bluntness when he showed that anyway. He wasn't the most honest guy in the world, but he did show it every now and then, and this is one of those occasions. Joab pretty much went to the king and told him straight up that he's got to stop this. I think we can't help but remember that Joab is the reason the king is mourning in the first place, because he killed him. He killed Absalom against the king's orders. However, Joab actually has a point in this case. He's not totally being biased and saying, quit mourning for Absalom because of his own guilt in the matter, but he actually has a point. And he tells him, he accuses the king, maybe overstepping the bounds a little bit. He says, you've covered the faces of all your servants with shame today. The same way he covered his face, he says, you've covered everybody with shame. You're making everybody be ashamed of saving you and delivering you and the nation from this rebellion. And then he accuses the king of being willing to trade. If he had the choice, he would trade all of his soldiers and servants' lives to get Absalom back. Now, we don't know if that was true or not. Of course, it wasn't an option anyway. But if it was an option, we don't know if David would do that. But Joab is at least saying, this is the impression you're given. You're giving the impression that you would be happy if Absalom had lived, even if all of us had died, had been killed. So that was a bold move on Joab's part, which Joab was nothing if he wasn't bold. And we get the impression that David also sort of heard his warning. He heeded it. He heard a little bit of sense in it. But what Joab suggested is, if you don't stop this right now, verse 7, he says, not one man will stay with you tonight. They'll all be gone. And it'll be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. Maybe that's what snapped David out of it a little bit. He arose and took his seat in the gate. So he modified his behavior a little bit. He was probably still just as hurt inside, but he started doing things that were more normal for the king to be doing. So all the people came before the king, verse 8 says. He led the nation in the past, and he did so well, and now he's going to do it again. But first, he was going to have to return to Jerusalem. Because you remember, he had to leave, him and his men had to leave the city, the royal city, because of Absalom. That's how big of a deal it was. He had to leave. And now, he's going to have to come back. And until he returns to Jerusalem, things can't go back to normal. So that's his plan now. He's got to return. So verses 9 and 10 says, and all the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, the king delivered us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he's fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? Isn't it time that we got to bring him back now, right? Nobody seems to be talking about that. Apparently, that's what they were saying. So it says, King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house when the word of all Israel has come to the king? You are my brothers. You're my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of my army from now on in place of Joab. And he swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, return, both you and all your servants. So the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan. So it was alarming to David, it seems, that Judah was the last of the tribes to be calling for the return of King David. Now, why was that alarming to him? That's his own tribe. Of all the 12 tribes, he was from Judah. So you would expect, based on common sense or reason and the way things usually worked, that Judah would be the first ones to be calling him back. But for whatever reason, they were the last. And David sort of put a little pressure on them, I guess, put them on the spot by sending this message to them and saying, why should you be the last? Well, that was enough, because now they're on board as well. Of course, Absalom would have been from the tribe of Judah as well, because David was. But still, you would think that they would have been behind David wholeheartedly. So his plan now is to return, and now he's been given the okay, at least approval to do that. So that's what he's going to do. And as he's coming back then, another character comes up, or a character that we didn't see in this study, because we didn't begin in that section. But his name is Shimei. the son of Gera, the Benjaminite. Now, sometimes the clan or tribe of a person is mentioned just as a matter of fact, kind of like who their father was. But in this case, it's significant for the same reason that we just talked about with Judah. Now, what would be significant about this man Shimei being a Benjaminite? Can anybody think of any reason why that might be a significant factor in what's about to be recorded here? As it relates to David? King Saul was a Benjaminite. He was from Benjamin. Well, who had Saul made basically his number one enemy during his reign? David, who was of Judah. Well, since David was made number one enemy by Saul, guess who the Benjaminites would typically also view as a huge enemy? David. Because just for the sole reason of Saul's a Benjaminite, he's one of us, he hates David, so I hate David because I'm a Benjaminite. It's not a very good way to think or to operate, but so many times it is the way we operate, isn't it? The enemy of my friend is my enemy. Although in this case it's even more than that. It's way stronger than that. I'm a Benjaminite. Our leader, the king who's a Benjaminite, hates this man, so I have to hate this man. He's my enemy. Period. Nothing else matters. It doesn't matter that God has chosen David. It doesn't matter that God has unchosen Saul. Nothing matters. David is Saul's rival, which he really wasn't, but Saul said he was, and therefore he's my rival because I'm from Benjamin. Totally biased and prejudiced way of thinking. But Shimei was a Benjaminite. And this is not the first time he's shown up. The last time he showed up was when David was away from the city again in chapter 16. Some bits that we skipped in this narrative, the last few lessons. And he comes out to David, not to meet him in a cordial or respectful way. He comes out to curse him like a true Benjaminite, hating on David. Now, however, he comes out, it says, with the men of Judah. He hurried to come down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And with him were 1,000 men from Benjamin. Now, so far, we don't really know exactly what his purpose is, but it sounds like this could get ugly again. However, what we read is that when the king was about to cross over the Jordan, Shimei, verse 18, fell down before the king and said, "Let not my Lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my Lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down to meet my Lord the king." Well, Abishai said, he was one of David's right-hand men, it seems, commanders. He said, Shimei ought to be put to death. In fact, the way he says it, shall not Shimei be put to death? As if it's, understood that what else could happen, what else would be the right thing to do, but for Shimei to be put to death because he cursed Jehovah's anointed. But David said, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel?" And the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. So here again we see David almost, I think there are some minor differences, but it's similar to as he had been in the past. How he's being encouraged to do something, act in a certain way, but his own humility, it seems, maybe, restrained him. I'm not putting anybody to death. Now, a more selfish and prideful man would have said, you're absolutely right. He's a dead man. Nobody curses the king when I'm the king and lives to tell about it. Or nobody has the right to curse Jehovah's anointed. He must die. David, he wasn't interested in blood, any more blood. Enough blood has been spilled. He's not going to die. That alone just shows David's, if not humility, in one sense of the term, at least in the sense of he doesn't get overly tripped up over himself. He didn't take it personally in the sense of, I've got to act so that other people don't think that they can just go around and curse me. And that he was wise for that much at least. He wasn't going to give in to this. He forgave Shimei. You know, a lesser man even might have said, now I don't really want to have to do this, but I have to. This cannot go unpunished. I have to do this. I hate that it has to be done, but Abishai's right. He has to be put to death. But no, David, he didn't even do that. He said, he's not going to die. And he swore by an oath that he wouldn't die. Very powerful example for us. David understood forgiveness, especially at this point in his life when he had so recently, or fairly recently, been forgiven of horrible things that he did. He needed forgiveness, and therefore he understood that others needed forgiveness. And he received forgiveness, and therefore he was willing to give others forgiveness. We should follow his example in that, which what we talked about last week in our sermon about horizontal forgiveness. All right, now verses 24 through 30, we meet, or not meet, but in our study at least, we come up to a man named Mephibosheth. He's called the son of Saul here, but he really wasn't the son of Saul. He was the grandson of Saul. He was Jonathan's son. And we all probably remember the kind of relationship that David and Jonathan had with each other. They were as close can be, more than brothers. Jonathan is one of the most the greatest and most humble and righteous men of integrity that you'll ever find in the Scriptures. And he was sadly murdered or killed in battle along with his father because of that decree, that his own rebellion against God. He was sadly killed in the battle there. But David and all of his sons were killed, by the way. And everybody, they thought. But there was this young man named Mephibosheth who somehow survived it. The grandson. And David finds out about him, and he takes him in out of because he's the last one, it seems. Jonathan's own son. Brings him in and gives him the land of his father, and pretty much takes him into the king's own house and feeds him from the king's table. He's just like one of the king's sons. So that's a part that we didn't see in our study, but that's a very important part of this. Because when he pops up here, what we learn, incidentally, in another part that we skipped over in this study is he didn't go with David when David left the city. And that apparently became a matter of contention or rubbed David the wrong way. So now David returns to Jerusalem, and the whole nation is going to be a part of this in one way or another. And it says, Mephibosheth, the son or grandson of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes. from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. That's just a little tidbit to sort of set the tone of what's about to happen. Verse 25 says, when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, "Why didn't you come with me, Mephibosheth? Why didn't you leave with me?" He took it as a personal slight and as a sign of, what he had in his heart. Well, it's probably significant to point out, or certainly is, if we skip back a little bit, another thing that we didn't see is that Ziba, anybody know who Ziba is? Ziba, let's see, it's in our text here. Verse 17, whose house did Ziba serve? Saul's house. He was Saul's household servant, and he became Mephibosheth's household servant, more or less. Well, whenever he came out and didn't have Mephibosheth with him, David naturally wanted to know the same question he's asking here. Where's Mephibosheth? And Ziba said that he refused to come with us because he believed that the kingdom was now going to be restored to Saul's house. That's chapter 16, verse 3. And that he wanted that to happen. Ziba's implying that Mephibosheth saw this as an opportunity for you to fall and for the rightful glory of his father and grandfather's house to be restored. So that's why he's not here with you. I think the context of chapter 19, this section here, verses 24 through 30, suggests without doubt that was a lie. It's not a matter of, well, Mephibosheth says one thing, Ziba says another thing, because the writer of 2 Samuel seems to me to already have informed us that was a lie by letting us know from the very start that he was absolutely devastated by the departure of David. There's another thing that's significant about Mephibosheth. Anybody remember what characteristic there was about him? He was lame in some way. He was not totally able-bodied. So there's that to consider as well. He, for that reason, could easily be taken advantage of or left behind or something like that. Well, the fact that before Mephibosheth's claim is even mentioned, the inspired writer himself goes ahead and tells us how he reacted when David had to leave. That shows us that his heart, it shows us that what Ziba said is a lie. He was devastated. He stopped taking care of himself. He didn't trim his beard. He didn't wash his clothes from the day that David left until this day that he's back. So when David asked him, "Why didn't you go with me?" he said, "My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king, for your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I then to cry to the king?" So Mephibosheth obviously found out at some point what Ziba did. That Ziba had done what he did. That's recorded in chapter 16. And he says, he deceived me. That's the part that, as far as I recall, isn't recorded, in what way he deceived him. But we do have a record of the slandering. That's what we read in chapter 16. He made up to David that Mephibosheth had ulterior motives. He didn't want to come because he thought he wants you to fall and for the kingdom to be restored to his father's house. That, he says, was a lie. And he deceived him in some way, which we just have to speculate how Ziba he did some scheme to make sure that Mephibosheth was unable to come. Told him we're leaving at a different time than they actually were, or something like that. So in other words, Mephibosheth said, I had every intention to come. I was supposed to come. I wanted to be by your side, but I was deceived. And being handicapped in the way that he was, obviously made it difficult for him to just, do it all on his own and leave, whenever he found out. Plus, by the time he found out, it may have been too late, obviously. So there's his story. And the king said, why speak any more of your affairs? I've already decided. You and Ziba shall divide the land. Now, without the context of chapter 16, it's difficult to know what that means, because remember, he said, you will get the land of your father Saul. But then whenever he heard what Ziba said, he said, okay, you get it. You get the land. I'm giving it to you. Well, now we might expect David to say, okay, very well, I renounce what I said before. I rescind it. I take it back. The land's yours. But instead, he says, you'll get it. You both get it. So it's going to be divided. So he didn't take it back. He didn't reinstate the way it was before. Now they're going to split it, he says. And as to why David did that, we don't know. Some have suggested one thing, some another thing. Some say this was kind of selfish of David, saving face a little bit, or maybe, being very careful to not make the wrong choice politically or selfishly. But whatever the reason, that's what he decided. Maybe because he had no way of proving who was telling the truth. And so he said, okay, you can split it. Well, Mephibosheth says, I don't want it. I don't want half of it. He can have it all. It's enough for me that my Lord the King is safely home. Well, again, that alone shows that he was telling the truth. It seems to me anyway, when we pair it with verse 24. His version, in the light of verse 24, is obviously the one that has more weight behind it. He didn't want the land. Land meant nothing to him. It was enough of a reward for him that the king's back safe. So what in the world can we learn from any of this? What lessons can we learn? Not to leave Jerusalem whenever somebody don't like you. That wouldn't be a very applicable lesson to learn. Well, here's something we can learn. Sometimes it's tempting to harbor ill will toward those who have wronged us. It's not just tempting, it's easy. We should follow David's example in the matter of Shimei. Instead of choosing to punish him, he chose to be merciful. Shimei asked forgiveness. He said, I sinned. That thing that I did, I sinned. What more could you ask for from somebody who has wronged you than that they come to you and say, please don't take it to heart. I know that I sinned in what I did. It was wrong. And I'm ashamed of it. I shouldn't have done it. Well, according to Jesus' instruction, that should be the end of it. In addition to other places like Matthew 5:7, when he said, blessed are the merciful, they shall receive mercy. The next chapter, he says, if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive you. If your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. There's exactly what David did. Following Jesus' teaching before Jesus ever even had a teaching. So we should definitely follow it. Number two, we should be cautious regarding who or what we believe. Maybe now more than ever. We live in a time, a unique time of human history when information is more readily available than ever before. You realize that? We might take it for granted, but the world's never been like this. Where, at our fingertips, even in the last few decades, but especially now, if you got one of these things, in a matter of seconds, you can find, a whole day's worth of reading or information. But here's the thing, it may not all be true or accurate. But even when we're talking about, from people directly, we need to be careful. When Ziba brought those provisions to David, he said that Mephibosheth wanted to be king, and that's why he didn't come. Now that was the only thing David had heard. Where's Mephibosheth? He didn't want to come. He's no longer with us. He's not physically with us. He's no longer, in spirit with us because he wants to be king, and he's looking for your downfall. Well, as far as David knew, that was the truth. However, Mephibosheth gave a totally different story. Who was telling the truth? Well, like we just pointed out, the text, it doesn't explicitly say which one was telling the truth. It never directly says which one was true and which one was lying. As far as the text is concerned, for all we know, Ziba was telling the truth, and now Mephibosheth is doing what Shimei did, more or less, and trying to backtrack, take it back and be like, well, he lost the fight, so now I got to come and deny everything. But again, I think the text indirectly hints that he was telling the truth. But as far as David was concerned, David didn't have 2 Samuel 19:24 to tell him that Mephibosheth was absolutely grieving and mourning and devastated at the turn of events like we have. So if I was David, which one would I believe? I need to be careful which one I believe. David could have easily believed Ziba like he did and may have just outright said, no, Mephibosheth, I know you're lying. Ziba's already told me. I know why you didn't come, so I don't believe you. Proverbs 18:17 says, the one who states his case first seems right until another comes and examines him. Isn't that true? Generally speaking, the one you hear first is going to seem, the idea is he seems right because that's the only one you've heard. And if we're not careful, we may automatically take that one to be true without exception. But what we ought to do is not just hear the other side, but examine maybe the story. Don't just take it at face value, but consider it. That's really what the verse is saying. Proverbs 18:17 is not to necessarily, he's not saying until another one comes and tells a different story, but until another comes and examines him, inquires, give me more details, tell me more. And it may turn out that his story is full of holes, This isn't, you tried to just let it go with this one statement, but the more you say, the more it seems that something's not right here. And then you'll look further. So we need to be careful about who we believe or what we believe in all points, whether it's stories that somebody tells, explanations, whether it's supposed scientific facts. The word fact is greatly abused these days. Just take it for granted that this is a scientific fact that's been proven when nothing could be farther from the truth. Number 3, when making a judgment call, we must be careful to take the course of greatest wisdom and rightness. Whatever is right, whatever is wise. At the very least, again, we don't know his reasoning, but David still, from his vantage point, he still did with what he had, he made the wisest choice. Because he had no way at that point of knowing anything further than this one says this and this one says this. And therefore, you remember Solomon later on with the women who said, were both claiming that the child was theirs. He didn't have any way. Could do a maternity test back then. So it was kind of a risky move, I guess, but it turned out to be wise in the long run. He came up with a way that ultimately revealed if not who the child's mother really was, it revealed the woman who deserved to have the child, because one of them said, okay, fine, do it. Which is hard for us to believe, but anyway, the point is, Solomon took the course of the greatest wisdom, and in that way, David did that here. This is why sometimes we talk about, this choice is right and this choice is wrong. Well, that's a gimme. That's a no-brainer. If I got this one, kill somebody, don't kill somebody. Well, that should be an easy choice. But what about when I have two options that are, neither one is inherently wrong? Does that mean it just doesn't matter which one I choose? Not necessarily, because I should still think about, well, which one would have the best result? Which one would be more effective? Which one is better? There's still going to be one that's better. Even if it's just a teensy little bit better, we should be careful. Weigh these things out. Consider these things. David's decision reflected great wisdom in that way. Jesus said when he sent his disciples out on their limited commission, he said, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Wise as serpents. And by the way, I can't speak to how wise serpents are. I don't want to know how wise they are. I don't really want anything to do with them. But apparently they have some sort of cunning in their general behavior, or maybe Jesus is referring to something else. But the point he's making is pretty clear. As far as your rightness goes, be innocent, harmless, like doves. But as far as your cunning, for lack of a better word, because that kind of has a negative connotation, be wise as serpents. Be deliberate, be well thought out, planned out, examine things, take it into great consideration. Be wise. Jesus in another place said, the sons of this world are wiser in their own generation than the sons of light. I think we're in this nation starting to see just how true that statement is, that sometimes people that do evil outsmart the people who want to do good in order to get their way. That's a generally true statement. Well, we shouldn't, those who have morals and operate on the principles of God's will should never fight fire with fire, so to speak. We should never adopt the unjust and immoral principles and practices of wicked people in order to overcome them. But we should try to match their wiseness in the way that Jesus means it in that way. Be wise as serpents, but not stooping to their level. Maintain your innocence as doves, but do the thing that is the greatest, reflects the greatest wisdom and rightness in everything, every single decision we make, which may seem overwhelming, but it's not impossible. The little things matter as much, maybe not as much, but equally in one sense as bigger things. Jesus, again, he said that himself. He who is faithful in little will be faithful in much. And he who is unfaithful in little will be unfaithful in much. So little things do matter. And we shouldn't just take them for granted as not really making a difference what choice I make, because it's a little thing, nobody will know about it, nobody will ever find out, etc., etc. Wise as serpents, innocent as doves. Okay, somebody else talk. anything. Any words?
Other than in God's Word, truth is hard to find today
Yes.
because there's so much deception in the world.
Yep. Whenever deception becomes the primary modus operandi, the MO of people on the TV and internet and whatever else, that's all the more reason that we got to be extra careful not to fall for it. And whenever we stop becoming a thinking people, not just a feeling people that get carried away, we've been where we left off in our study of Acts last Sunday afternoon, was the people of Ephesus rushing into the theater, and they're all worked up about Paul condemning idolatry and Artemis, and they're shouting and hooting and hollering and calling for blood and everything, and then it says half of them didn't even know why they were there. One of them was shouting one thing, another was shouting another thing, and they were like, what's the thing that we're doing here again? But here they are joining in. You see, they got carried away with the wave of emotionalism and didn't even stop to think. What's going on here? And am I on the right side? Maybe I don't agree with these people. What are they actually trying to accomplish? Well, every single citizen of every single country that even has a free election should think about that when elections come up. Because deception is the name of the game. And I want you to believe something that's not true because that gets me your vote. Because if I tell you what's really going on, you would never vote for me. That's the way that political games are played nowadays, and we should not be so naive as to just take at face value what anybody says about anything, but examine, look further into it, and most importantly, compare it to the mirror of Scripture. What would God think about this policy, or this campaign, or this administration? What does God think? That's a question maybe we don't ask nearly enough. What does God think? Any other thoughts, comments?
The only thing that we can know for sure at this time is completely truthful is the Word of God.
Yep.
There's nothing else there's so much deception and everything. It may or may not be true, but the Word of God doesn't change, and it's probably God's always true. That's the only thing we can really fall back on.
Yeah, 100% without question, we can fall back on God's Word. At least fall back on it in the sense of if I'm out trying to find truth, I know that I can come to this and not have to worry about whether it's true. But it should be our starting point and our ending point is Scripture. What do the principles of God's Word say? And that should dictate what I believe, what I think or how I think, who I vote for, what I do. It should dictate everything. Not anything else matters at the end of the day, except is this contrary in any way to God's will? And if so, I need to move as far away from it as I can.